Well, hey everyone, I want to introduce to you my friend Sam. I'll let Sam tell you a little bit about himself. But last time that I talked to Sam on this, he asked me a funny question, and I'm trying to remember what it was. Do you remember,
Oh,
Sam?
dude, I don't remember what I said to you before this.
so
I don't
so
remember
I'll ask
much.
you.
Okay, go.
So I'll ask you: Are you a cat or a dog person, and why?
Dog person. Cat, I mean, some have argued that cats are actually from the pits of hell. I don't I don't necessarily agree with that because only because my wife's a cat person.
Mm.
But I see their argument. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I'm a dog person clearly. In fact, I have two grand dogs. One's my daughter's dog, one's my son's dog, and one's a lab, black lab, and the other one's a old English bulldog.
Mm.
And actually, my wife and I are in a weird spot because I'm sleeping with the dog on the couch constantly because he's still a little puppy and he needs cuddles. So yeah, I
Well,
love dogs. Love dogs.
I I've always wanted to have a old English bulldog, an
Oh
English bulldog.
gosh,
So
they're they're insane, man. Because they're cute as a button and they're super cuddly and affectionate, but the bulldog is the right because they are like literally I have to when because he tries to get outside because he wants to follow me, and I have to do these weird contortions with my body and distract him because he'll just like he's like a tank, man. He'll just like bull through the door. It's crazy. So he's a tough one to train so far.
I bet. I'll have to come.
Mhm.
I'll have to come meet him sometime.
Oh yes, I'll
Yeah,
usually bring him everywhere I go. You'll see him sooner or later.
perfect. Perfect. Well, I was going to explain what you do, but there are many different facets to what you do. So,
Yeah.
would you mind taking a stab at it?
I like to say I'm a maker of kingdom mischief. That's what I like to say. But I guess that's a
Sure.
kind of a weird title. But I do two things. I got my I'm the gig economy supreme. I guess multiple streams of doing things. My one gig is I'm the pastor over at the Southeastern Wesley Foundation over in Hammond on the campus of Southeastern Louisiana University, and I hate oh gosh this title is so long it's ridiculous. Associate Director of Office of Congregational Development and Transformation. I help people plant churches. That's basically what I do. And
Mhm.
yeah, that's my two main gigs.
Awesome. So, for everybody at Mid City, whenever I talk about I'm meeting with one of my mentors, Sam is one of the people that I meet with at least once a month. Sam and Gloria, and
Mhm.
pick their brains, and they pick my brain, and I love. Thank you for all of that. So,
Oh no,
yeah,
thank you guys, man.
yeah.
And yeah, you guys should. I don't know if Fernie told you, but like I even wrote about you guys in a book that got published. So no, you guys are doing some. It's interesting. There's a lot of things you all are doing that we're like, what? And it's like so it's actually kind of interesting
Mhm.
to see you guys birthing something completely new and different and very unique over in Mid City.
Mhm. Well, I have that same type of reaction sometimes after we try new stuff.
Yeah, it's like everybody's like, how did you do that? I'm like, I don't know, dude.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the reason I brought you on is because we're in the middle of our sermon series asking for a friend.
Hmm.
And every week we're asking different questions and wrestling with stuff. So the first week we talked about it's important to have questions. And I
Hmm.
highlighted how throughout scripture, people have questions all the time. God or an angel appears to them sometimes and they respond with a question. How can I
Yep.
know? Or how will it be? Or, they always ask questions. And this idea that part of being a Christian is asking questions, not
Hmm.
just accepting everything blindly. Last week we brought on Reverend Brady, and
Hmm.
we talked about can science and religion coexist. And
Oh.
so I don't know if you know this, but Brady has become a stargazer,
Oh
and
yeah.
yeah, so
I
he
love it.
showed us some pictures that he's taken when he goes out to look at the stars, and told us all about the constellations and the galaxies, and it was a really fun conversation. But this week, I want to go a different direction, um, just a little bit. But
A
I've been
lot of
thinking a
it.
lot about yeah, I've been thinking a lot about suffering
Mm.
and how to reconcile suffering and God. And so, just to give you a couple of examples, So my parents got divorced when I was in well, they got divorced the day before I left for college.
Mm,
So I was a 18-year-old.
mm.
But when I was in middle school, in seventh grade, I went on a mission trip, and the youth director looked at me and he was trying to get to know me, and he said, "Yeah, so tell me about your parents. How long have they been married?" And I told them, and I said, "Well, they've been married. I think at the time it was like 20 years, but I'm pretty sure they're gonna get divorced soon." Like there
Oh
was
my
something in
gosh.
me that I just knew as a seventh grader that they were gonna get divorced. And so when they finally got divorced, even though I knew about it and I knew it was coming, it hurt, and I was sad,
Mm,
and there was a part of me that asked the question, how could God let my suffering happen? And I've asked
mm,
those questions, yeah, whenever I went through a breakup, whenever I transitioned to a new place and I missed home. Anytime there's suffering, I think we ask the question, where is God, or why did God allow this to happen? And so I'm curious, your thoughts. Have you experienced something like that? And how do you reconcile that question?
oh yes, gosh, yes. I think a lot about my childhood. Because I think everybody has family of origin uh, baggage. And
Mhm,
for me, I grew up extremely poor. My dad suffered from post traumatic stress from Vietnam, and so
mhm,
there was a lot of. I mean, there was even one point in our life we lived in a car for 6 months, and I mean, I grew up around suffering constantly, and I really think it's why, for most of my life, well, at least the first part of my life anyway, I'm 47 now, but for the first half of my life so far, I mean, I was not a Christian. And in fact, my exposure to religion at all uh, did a very poor job of explaining to me why all these bad things were happening, you know?
mhm,
And so I was like, well, this is all crap. It
mhm,
doesn't do anything. It doesn't explain anything. It just makes your life more difficult. Or what is I learn later. It's opium for the masses kind of thing.
mhm,
But as I got older and obviously a little bit more mature and seeing life and suffering in a different way, even in my atheism, there's just some things that couldn't be explained. And it's a long journey for me when it comes to suffering. And I will say this, I mean, there is no right answer, I don't think, because it's one of those things that I know we talk about the mystery of our faith a lot, but I think suffering is truly a mystery, and not from the senses we cannot ever know. It's just like we will endlessly know and understand what it means. It's just a complex thing. I know people have written libraries about the subject of the theodicy, and I know for me, one of the big questions was one of the things that changed, well, at least made me start really thinking about it was it was actually, I heard this question in seminary, was we always ask, why does bad things happen to good people, but why do good things happen to bad people, or why do good things happen to good people, why do good things happen at all?
mhm,
And that's when for me I'm just like, huh, why do good things happen? And I sometimes I wonder, like, for me anyway, I can't answer it for anybody else. For me, that actually was a better question for me,
mhm,
because it's like it's super easy to explain why bad things happen. I think, but why good things happen, that's different. And that's really started me really thinking about this. But for me, the one thing that's really, in my perspective, I can't get away from the fact that God gave us free will, and I just I'm never, I've tried to look in, I've tried to be a reformed person at one point in my life. I study that theology, and it just doesn't make sense to me. Like, how can we say that God is ultimate good, and yet the Holocaust? Or how come there's ultimate, God is ultimate good, but divorce or poverty or these, and it just doesn't make sense. And I think what really started clicking in for me was like Augustine's understanding
mhm,
of evil. How, and this is not an ultimate statement by any means, but I love how he kind of painted this picture of, evil is not a created thing, it's the lack of a created thing, you know. And so it's like,
mhm,
you don't look at a hole and say it's a thing, it's a lack of a thing, so it's a lack of
mhm,
dirt. That's what the hole is. And
Mhm.
so when I think about evil a lot, I think about it's a lack of good. It's a lack of, God. Now that doesn't explain everything by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it just puts things in perspective a little bit. But I mean, for me, like with free will, I just don't think we. First of all, I think love can't be love. If God is good, there's no way He's going to God's going to make us love God. And
Mhm.
so there
Mhm.
there has to be some amount of free will in that. And I'm here to tell you, I know John Wesley was still pretty big about God being sovereign, even with grace, even the ability for us to recognize God through prevenient grace comes from God.
Mhm.
But even if part of us is even 0.5% free will, because there has to be free will, I don't know how much.
Yeah.
uh that I think that's a lot more than we give credit for, and like how much chaos that can bring to the world. Does
Mhm.
that make any sense so
Oh, it
far?
makes complete sense. I think that's at the core of my answer to that question is
Hmm.
free will. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of times with suffering, we 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 look at suffering and we look at it as punishment
Hmm.
rather than consequences. And I think they're very
Yes.
different, right? So
Hmm.
I think sometimes if we look at suffering as punishment, we assume God is punishing us because we must have done something wrong. And so I
Hmm.
remember when Katrina hit. Were you in New Orleans when Katrina hit?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So I
I
remember
have a
when
whole
it hit.
story with
I
that.
bet you do.
Yeah.
I remember when it hit. So I was in El Paso at the time, and I remember hearing a lot of reports about. Well, of course it hit there. It's a sin city, and there's so much sin that happens in the French
Oh
Quarter,
yeah.
and so it got portrayed as God is punishing the people in New Orleans. Which like it didn't even hit the French Quarter. I mean, there was water but there's always
Yeah.
water, right? And so I find that part really um, heartbreaking that we look at stuff like that and we say God is punishing us. I
Hmm.
think I think when we look at suffering as a consequence of human action, I think for me it changes everything, right? So there's
Yes.
suffering in this world because we're humans and we fall short and we hurt people and we make
Hmm.
decisions that hurt other people. So when the stock market crashes, God isn't punishing everybody who works on Main Street or Wall Street.
Mm-mm.
It's just decisions that people made that ended up hurting people,
Yep.
not just financially but emotionally, spiritually, and I think for me there's this big there has to be this separation of my suffering is not a punishment.
Yeah.
God isn't trying to teach me a lesson through it. God isn't being mean. It's simply a consequence of our human actions. So I even look at like cancer, right? I
Yeah.
have a good friend who died from cancer a couple of years ago. Like I don't think God gave her cancer. I think
Hmm.
her cancer came from there's so many chemicals in the air and so much stuff that we've done throughout the years. I think it's not God hurting her
No.
or choosing to pick on her. I think it's just
No.
consequences of our human actions.
Yeah, exactly. And then see, now the question becomes, well, okay, now we kind of get an idea where suffering, like why it happens, but where, like you said before, now the question comes, like, where does God in all this?
Yeah.
And you see, that's why, man, I just keep coming back to, I mean, duh, keep coming back to Jesus, and
Yeah.
like I hate. I mean, well, I don't hate. I really get a little like frustrated when people try to narrow the what Jesus did like on the cross as just this is what it is, and it's like it is, but it's so much bigger. And you see, like when all the suffering that Jesus went through, and and then was resurrected, I think really it tells us a couple different things. It tells us like, listen, I'm suffering with y'all. This is even, and this is a dangerous thing to say, and I know a lot of people get mad if I say this, is like there's actually something about God that like God can't do a few things, and not because God can't. Maybe God won't,
God won't.
back to our free will,
Yeah.
because once again, if God steps in anything of our free will, then it's just going to muck up this whole,
Mhm.
love business. But God is not only is familiar with suffering, God suffers with us, and then God tells us that there's you're going to figure out one day, you're going to see that that suffering will there was a the suffering wasn't pointless, that and that there will be, I hate, this big term, there'll be salvation from it, there'll be you'll be saved from it eventually, that all of creation will be saved from it, or freed from it, maybe a better way to say it. And that it doesn't like it when you're in the midst of suffering, it doesn't solve everything, but at least gives you the one of the most important things that I think that Christianity is supposed to do well is provide hope. That yeah, it sucks what you're going through. We have no idea where it came from or why. We got a few ideas, but there's hope. No matter where it ends up, there's hope at one point coming. And
Mm-hmm.
I know that's what's helped me a little bit, is be like, okay, it's like I'm suffering right now, but there'll be a point where I'll be freed from it, and I'll come to understand it a little bit. And I'll tell you what, my wife and I were just talking about getting older. It's just like, I really am getting to the point in my life where I was like, that suffering that I went through was horrible. But I'm 10 years, 20 years away from it now. And I'm like, whoa, wow. It taught me a lot. It showed me a lot. It humbled me a lot, which is something that,
Mm-hmm.
I desperately need a lot of times. But, and that's how I've come to answer suffering. And I know, like in my one ministry with the Wesley, most of who we talk to are people who aren't Christian, and some of these questions, come up, and I remember it was one, I can't remember who said it, but it was one of those types of things where I was actually, oh, that's right, I was at an apologetics conference one time, and somebody who was an atheist stood up, and he's like, and he named all these stats about all these suffering people, starvation, this and that. And he asked that question that I used to ask when I was an atheist, is like, where is God and all that? And I don't necessarily like how the dude responded so much, because it was kind of a gotcha, but it's a good response. If it would have been done a little bit more softly, I think, was his response was, well, God's asking you the same question. Where were you during these things?
Mm-hmm.
And see, and that's what I think, that we as Christians, but more as humans, we don't like taking responsibility for stuff, and I'm not saying that, like, people are doing all these horribly nefarious things that are hurting people, but once again, I think that when it comes to our free will, it's a huge gift from God that we can take ownership of. And I may not be able to solve all of the hunger in the world, but I can solve the hunger that's around me, or or even cancer, or anything big
Mm-hmm.
like that. I don't have the circle of influence to cure cancer, but I certainly can come to somebody's bedside that's suffering from it and be a little bit of, comfort to them in their time of need. And I think that sometimes that's our answer for suffering, is like, it's right in front of us, and I know that's one of the big things that in my more immature years I would say to folks, that, because we all, listen, I'm going to spill some pastor tea, but it's like, it's one of those type of things where we all struggle to get people to engage in quote unquote mission to care for people.
Mm-hmm.
And I would always get frustrated, be like, see, when I was starving in, because I was at one point starving in a trailer park with cockroaches all over me, all the church wanted me to do was get them to come to their VBS.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, why don't you just come to me and feed me? Or why don't you come and give my dad some mental health care and a job? Or, you see what I'm trying to
Yeah.
get at, is like,
Yeah.
sometimes the suffering, the alleviation of suffering is right in front of us, and how
Mm-hmm.
we can solve it.
I'm thinking about. Thank you for sharing that. Um,
Yeah.
I'm trying to find it in this, but I'm thinking about the story in Job, where all this suffering happens in his life, and his friends come over, and the very first thing they do is just sit there in his suffering with him. And if I remember correctly, I think it even says that they wept with him. Um, and I just find that, ignore the rest of that book for a second. I
Yeah.
find that moment, because for those of you, if you haven't read the whole book, they start like trying to tell him that surely he did something wrong and he just needs to get
Hmm.
over it and all that kind of stuff. But in that moment, they just sit there with him. And I think like you hinted at this, but in the face of suffering, sometimes the best thing we can do is just sit with people and say, I don't know why this happened. It sucks.
Hmm.
And I'm going to sit here with you through it. And yeah.
And the same for us who's suffering is, I think, like what I've tried to do. One of the biggest things I've tried to do is when I'm in like suffering from something is to seek somebody out and
Mm-hmm.
be like and share that with them. It's like, man, and you know what? I can tell you my life hasn't gotten easier, but it's gotten better
Yeah.
because now I can go through a bout of suffering, but at least I'm not alone. And for some
Mhm,
reason it does make things easier to get through it if you
mhm.
catch what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me see if I can sum up everything that we talked about today.
Yeah. The
And I'm not
theodicy
gonna.
in 1 minute.
Yes. Um, one, we talked about. Well, I'm gonna skip around. So there really isn't a perfect
Mm,
answer to why is there suffering,
no.
and we'll never come up with it. And I think wrestling with it is healthy. But I think one of the other things we talked about was, when we are going through suffering, to try
Mhm.
to push away from this idea that God is punishing us for some
Mm,
reason,
yes.
and to begin to look at it through a lens of maybe like there's just suffering because we have free will and
Hmm.
we make decisions that just affect people.
Hmm.
And so they're consequences of human actions, not necessarily our actions sometimes. What's that, the butterfly effect, right? That something
Yeah.
can happen on the other side of the world that eventually
Hmm.
affects us here.
Yep.
We talked about that. What else am I forgetting?
Well, we talked about how when it comes to I guess our responsibility or our
Yeah,
capability
yeah.
to participate in the alleviation of suffering.
Hmm. Yeah. Adam Hamilton said, I wrote this down. He said, God is the source of hope and comfort in the face of suffering. And then he
Hmm.
goes on to say, the way God is the source of hope and comfort is by nudging us and pushing us to go and be the hands and feet that help, that
Yes.
serve those who are hungry, that help in hurricane recovery, that help when a building collapses, that God is present through all those people.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
awesome.
And to just own and to really, when you get those nudges, is to follow them the best you can, because that is the prayer, the answered prayer to somebody suffering.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, Sam, I want to thank you so much for
Oh,
this conversation. I'm sure that next time we see each other, we'll keep talking about this a little bit. And
oh
for those
yeah.
of you at home, yeah. And for those of you at home, I just want to thank you for joining us. I know that you'll probably continue talking about this and wrestling through this. And so we want to offer you a resource. We want you to text the word GROW, GROW, to the number 225-307-0662. And when you text that, you'll get a text message back, and it'll be a link to a home sheet. It'll include the scripture that we talked about, some of the resources that I've been looking at. It'll include some of the questions that Sam and I talked about, and maybe some other questions for you to think about. And it'll include a plan of action, how to live this out, and how to really wrestle with this moving forward. And our hope is that you'll continue to wrestle with these questions and with this topic with your coworkers, with your friends, with your family members. So use this as a resource as we continue to have these conversations.
Hmm.
Sam, I really want to thank you so much for joining us.
Oh,
It's been a
thank
lot of
you.
fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for giving me the easy topic.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Well,
All
everyone, I
right.
want to thank you all for joining us. And remember, I love you, God loves you, and there's nothing you can do about it. I'll see you next
Oh,
week.
that's good.